Dragonfires by Steve Frazee, illustrated by Smith. The dragons were desperate for fuel, and considering their old enemies, who had a wonderful new substitute for charcoal. Unfortunately, men have a bad habit of exterminating anything in which they don't believe. On their way to the emergency meeting of the Grand Dragonhood Council, Dithyram 14 gave his chum, Gorgabub, the old narrow eye. A deep green, steady eye it was, but it did not bother Gorgabub. A fine young dragon, Dithyram was, scarcely more than 1,000 years old, broad in the shoulders, trim and powerful of tail. He said, "What's this big plot you're hinting at, and what makes you think Kuber 13 is stoking up to burn my tail?" He grunted when Gorgabub walked on 3 feet in order to brush the tiniest bit of Beowulf pollen from a gleaming scale. Gorgabub had always been a dandy, but now, what with Dragonvia in the fix it was, dragonfires were at the lowest point in history, extinction staring every inhabitant right in the stomach. Gorgabub gave the scale a final pat and grinned at Dithyram's irritation. "You can't tell what new young dragonettes may—" "I asked a couple of questions." Gorgabub, who had a good thing as manager of the filtration plant, minced a little in avoiding a dust-laden Beowulf plant, named after a human being conquered by a famous dragon warrior some years before in honorable combat. "You've been knocking yourself out for so many 100 years with your reforestation program that you don't know what's in the wind," Gorgabub said. "I'd better wise you up gradually by letting you start to answer the second question yourself." Gorgabub was a sharp one. He knew the angles. However, it didn't require a great deal of sense to know that Kuber 13, the biggest wholesale charcoal dealer in the country, had been chewing his fat tail ever since Dithyram took Francipip away from him at a charcoal burners picnic during one of the rare occasions when Dithyram had got away from his tree planting. The very thought of Francipip, only child of old Bellepop 48, Grand Master of the Grand Council, brought a sigh from Dithyram. He wished it could have been one of the pre-move sighs that used to curl blue flame from both nostrils. Even a little green flame would have been something, but the way charcoal was rationed these days, there was barely enough to keep the inner fires at minimum level for existence. So Dithyram sighed air, only slightly warm air from his meager ration of 2 days before. He sighed several times, thinking about Francipip. She had the most luscious angles of any dragonette in the land. Trim, pear-shaped scales, a tapering little tail, with the cutest spine projections. And when she looked at him with her soft, lavender eyes... Watching from the corner of his eye, Gorgabub smiled and stroked his burnished flame testers, antennae that would have been mustaches on the old foe, man. "Not in the least discounting the charms of Francipip. If I were the roaring type, I might do a little tail-womping for her favor myself." "Let's hear about this awful plot," Dithyram said. "I was merely trying to say that your thinking must extend beyond Francipip. Charming though she is a relatively minor prize in the coup that Kuber 13 is planning." "Be careful how you make accusations against a numbered one," Dithyram warned. "Nuts," Gorgabub said. "This is no time for musty tradition. Let's face facts, Dithy. We're starving to death, and you know it. Kuber saw it coming 300 years ago, and he's been laying plans all that time." Gorgabub definitely did not look starved. His scales were shiny, his nostrils had a hard, gleaming sheen, and his well-groomed flame testers had a used look. The managership of the filtration plant always carried with it a knockdown on charcoal consigned to the filter beds, which was just one of the lesser evils that had seeped into dragon ethics since the move, 800 years before. "I'll give you credit, Dithyram. If the council hadn't hamstrung you with half enough dragon power for your long-term reforestation plan, we might have pulled through. But it's too late now. This emergency session today isn't going to be the usual yak-yak deal that winds up with every dragon grumbling and going home to listen to his stomach growling until the next session." Gorgabub was so deadly serious, his rough spine extensions were erect, instead of flopping in their usual devil-may-care fashion. But he wasn't so serious that he forgot to let Dithyram go ahead to break trail through a mass of thorny Sigurd vines, named after a man who Dithyram's father had bested in fair fight in pre-move days. The way cleared, Gorgabub resumed his place at Dithyram's shoulder. At this meeting, one of Kuber's hench dragons, probably Bendar, is going to propose that we move away at once. Dithyram plowed to a stop and shook the earth with a tremendous tail whomp. Gorgabub leaped ahead slightly, 1 foot over his nose. "No use to get my scales all dusty," he complained. "Besides, my sinus has been bothering." "We can't move," Dithyram bellowed. "Any direction is outside. In the last 800 years, men have got so they don't believe in us anymore. This is our last refuge." Gorgabub blew dust off his left front foot and polished the claws against his stomach. "You think Kuber doesn't know that?" Dithyram snorted. Merely warm air again, although he felt like hurling flame 10 dragon lengths, approximately 252 feet. "You talk in circles." "We try to move outside," Gorgabub said. "You know what men do to things they don't believe in. How many of us would get back after man trouble started?" "Darned few," Dithyram scowled. "Guess who would be one?" "You." Gorgabub blinked his scarlet eyes and then smiled. "That's not what I was getting at, but since you mention it in your tactful way, you're dragon right I'd get back. I'll take care of number 1. "You haven't any number. You lost it over that affair with the 4th counselor's wife." "Are you going to be stuffy as well as technical? And as stupid as you were when you let Kuber nominate you for Grandmaster of the Advanced Detail during moves?" "That was 400 years ago," Dithyram said. "I didn't even know Francipip then. And besides, the title is only an honorary one. I haven't even drawn the extra bit of charcoal it allows me." "It was honorary then," Gorgabub said patiently, "but Kuber was looking way ahead to this very deal he's about to pull right now. The fact that you took Francipip away from him only speeded up things a little bit." He looked at Dithyram keenly. Dithy wasn't stupid, but he was so steeped in honor and tradition, and had been so absorbed in his futile efforts to produce trees faster than dragons needed charcoal that it took him a long time to get his thinking in gear. "What will happen to the advanced detail if we do try to move outside?" Gorgabub asked. Dithyram didn't like to dwell on that thought. He started down the tailway abruptly, scowling all the way back to the second row of reinforced cervicular scales on his neck. Gorgabub stood aside politely, not because Dithyram was a numbered one, but because there would be more Sigurd vines ahead. They clicked along rapidly. Now that Gorgabub had got a thought wound up, he said nothing and let it tick. It ticked a very unpleasant pattern in Dithyram's mind. If what Gorgabub had just said was true, the most terrible thing in dragon history was about to happen, worse than the time men had declared an all-out war on dragons after Dithyram's cousin, twice removed, had knocked off some character named St. Michael. Kuber was too smart to think that dragons could exist outside these days. But there was a bare chance, Dithyram thought, that Kuber might mastermind a majority vote on a move proposal. Hungry dragons were not thinking dragons, but by law 100 million years old, even those who opposed an issue were bound to abide by the decision of the majority. Men would knock the very waddles right off the whole nation if they went outside in force, and the advanced detail would be the first to get it. As Grand Master, Bellapop 48 could not retreat until the last dragon was safe. That would eliminate 14 and 48, and the next high number was 13. Kuber's. To Dithyram, numbering was a glorious part of dragon history. Every 1,000 years, the oldest male member of a family could add 1 number to his title, if the family maintained a record unblemished by any violation of dragon ethics, such as losing one's temper and scorching another dragon's tail in a whomping match, or stealing or cheating in any manner. Just one little fracture of ancient law by any member of a family, and the number went pfft, and then you had to start from scratch. Since the move, and then the charcoal shortage, numbers had fallen rapidly. The great gap between 14 and 48 indicated the terrible extent of wrecked honor caused by the pinch of hunger and a shocking moral laxity among members of the younger generation. Dithyram was carrying 14,000 years of family integrity, and he was proud of the heritage, but sometimes the honor rested heavily. He was obliged by the code not to believe anything wrong of any dragon until it was proved 3 times. In spite of his own thoughts engendered by what Gorgabub had told him, he really ought not to believe Kuber guilty of a vile plot. But he did. Come to think of it, Kuber had been the one who had always blocked Dithyram's efforts to get more dragon power for reforestation, and now he was sore about Francipip. "Old Bellipop gone, you wiped out in the first brush. Kuber taking a quick sneak back when the fighting starts, forcing Francipip to go with him." Gorgabub let that picture sink in. "Maybe 1/3 of us will get back. Kuber will be the Grandmaster then because of number seniority. There's about enough trees here now to take care of 1/3 of the present population. Of course, Kuber will really go to work on your reforestation program then, and in a few years' time the lunkheads will say it was his idea in the first place." "Shut up," Dithyram said. Worst of all was thinking about Francipip in Kuber's clutches. Dithyram 14 clicked along rapidly. His scowl was terrible to see, more fierce than his grandfather's had been, when the old warrior heard that some jerk of a man named St. George was making threats and boasting about what he was going to do to all the dragon population. The problem wasn't simple, because the evidence of Kuber's intentions was circumstantial. Charges against any dragon had to be presented before the Grand Council, and proved the first time by factual evidence before the Master-at-Arms could finish counting 300 with his tail. Kuber's plot, if it really existed, seemed incredible to Dithyram, not because it didn't have a good chance of working, but because Dithyram couldn't understand how anyone could be so undragonly as to do a thing like that. Of course, Kuber was a feculent-eyed character, and he'd been mighty close to losing his number in 2 or 3 brushes with the Council during a black goods investigation. Naturally, as the biggest charcoal dealer in the country, he would be subject to attack as a black goods operator. His name had been whispered over that latest crime, the theft of 10 tons of food from a government stockpile less than 2 months ago. Of course, there hadn't been any evidence that he had been involved. Dithyram began to wonder how Gorgabub knew so much. He studied his companion's condition carefully. Pretty good it was for just an average knockdown of charcoal from the filtration plant. And nothing had been wrong with the water during Gorgabub's term of office. "How come you know about this alleged plot?" Dithyram asked. Gorgabub looked innocent. "A lot of things go through the water department besides water. I have quite a Tristram vine of information." Dithyram broke a dust-loaded Beowulf leaf from the stalk. "Did your Tristram vine ever give you any hints as to who swiped the 10 tons of charcoal recently?" Gorgabub shook his head. "Not a thing," he said guilelessly. With a quick motion of his left foot, Dithyram slapped the dusty leaf across Gorgabub's face. Gorgabub fell back on his tail. His scarlet eyes fluttered, and his nose began to twitch. He seemed to swell, and then it came. A series of tremendous sneezes that caused his tail to thump the ground with each burst. Blue fire gushed from his nostrils. His flame testers lit up green, additional proof that the fire was from charcoal. "You don't know a thing about it, huh?" Dithyram bellowed. "You couldn't have knocked down enough charcoal from the plant to produce a flame like that. Come clean, Gorgabub." Gorgabub looked at his friend from streaming eyes. "I had nothing to do with stealing that stockpile." "You've been buying on the black goods market, then?" "No." Dithyram turned sideways and poised his tail. "I ought to whomp you until your legs stick out sideways and you're flat on your belly." "Save your energy. You're going to need it for a bigger job than whomping a friend who's trying to help you." And that was the truth. Dithyram began to realize after reaching the meeting grounds of the Grand Council. Not a counselor himself, because he already held an important post as chief of the reforestation program, at every session during the last 2 centuries, he had been so intent on securing larger appropriations of dragon power for his own department that he hadn't observed what had been growing among the citizens. He began to circulate. whomping aside a few immature dragons who were cavorting and biting each other's tails in the manner of adolescence. Now that his eyes were open, it didn't take him long to observe an undercurrent of disrespect for the High Counselors. There were a great many characters, well-fueled in appearance, smooth in their manner, who were moving among the crowd and talking. They weren't loud, but they were effective, leaving in their wake dragons who were beginning to chip their teeth and complain freely that the present High Council was the worst in history. How much longer is that doddering old fool of a Bellapop going to give us that things will improve line? You can bet the counselors are getting theirs. Something has got to be done. My stomach's been rolling something awful for 150 years, ever since that last ration cut. Look at Dithyram 14. Dithy is right. Reforestation, he's always yelling. By the time our inner fires are all out and we're dead, he'll have 4 or 5 little metasequoias big enough to eat. Then one of the shady, well-fueled agents spoke a little too loudly. I've always suspected that Dithyram was a tree-eater. Dithyram shouldered his way through to the speaker. It was Bendar, one of Kuber's key employees, whose exact duties with the charcoal firm had never been quite clear to Dithyram, now that he gave the matter thought. He was a lumpy-tailed, dark-eyed dragon. He eyed Dithyram without fear. When you call me that, smile, Dithyram said, coldly. Bender did smile, a sort of sneering grimace. Start trouble, big shot. Go ahead and see what happens to that wonderful number of yours. Dithyram was breathing hard, just warm air, of course, and that added to his feeling of futility. One of the most stringent of dragon regulations was that unauthorized violence at the council grounds automatically stripped the belligerents of their numbers, and Bendar had no number. Dithyram turned away. Tree-eater, someone called after him. You see what I was getting at? Gorgabub was at his shoulder. That propaganda didn't spring up unaided. I'm beginning to see, Dithyram said bitterly, while some of us have been wearing our tails down to the bone trying to help the country. He saw Kuber talking to Francipip a short distance ahead. Kuber's got some kind of terrific surprise to swing the move vote his way, and I'm trying to find out exactly... Gorgabub saw that Dithyram wasn't listening. Don't lose your head and your number. Play it smart, Dithy. A young dragonette bumped against Gorgabub, and he turned his head quickly. Well, strike me up a metasequoia tree, he cried, stroking his flame testers, if it isn't gorgeous little Fifimum. And that took care of Gorgabub for the moment. Kuber tipped his head back and smiled when Dithyram came close. Well, well, my old friend Dithyram. He stuck out his right foot like a counselor running for re-election. He was a big dragon, pale-eyed, heavy in the shoulders, and perhaps a little too heavy in the tail, but he was fast and powerful. You're looking a little grim about something. Kuber turned to Francipip. Isn't he, Pippy? Francipip gave Dithyram an odd look and said that he was a bit harsh in the teeth. She certainly was a beautiful dragonette, even when standing so close to a louse like Kuber, Dithyram thought. He mumbled a greeting to both of them and let go of Kuber's foot as soon as he could, but he didn't take his eyes from Kuber's face. I detect a little discontent among the citizens, Dithyram said. Kuber seemed concerned. He bit his lowered lip and nodded. I'm beginning to wonder just what's up. Frankly, I'm worried about what could happen if some idiot proposes that we move. What with the attitude you've mentioned, I shudder to think what might happen. He shuddered all the way down to the 3-pound diamond on the end of his tail. Dithyram could scarcely conceal his disgust. Legitimate shuddering was all right, say when talking or thinking about something horrible, like a man. But at other times, shuddering was a trick of vain dragons, because all it did was stir up the fires and make the scales gleam brightly. Francipip seemed impressed, and Kuber pretended not to notice how she was admiring him. An attempt to move would result in national suicide, Dithyram said flatly. Why, of course, Kuber said. We'll have to prevent it if we can. But of course, if the vote goes that way... You seem to think the matter will come to a vote, Francipip said. Kuber laughed indulgently and put one foot around her shoulder. She didn't try to move away, Dithyram noticed.
Now, don't you worry, little draggy. Perhaps Dithyram and I are prone to take things too seriously.
He patted her shoulder in a possessive sort of way.
A sweet little Tristram flower like you shouldn't bother her pretty head about matters of state.
Dithyram wanted to whomp him right in the big, fat, syrupy mouth. Up on the dais where Bellepop 48 and the council sat, the Master-at-Arms began to pound his tail on a rock drum. The meeting came to order with a smoothness that seemed ominous to Dithyram. Winklecup 10, the chaplain, gave the customary prayer for the soul of Winklecup 9, a famous warrior who had gobbled up a weakling man named Tristram. Stern and impressive with his gray flame testers drooping below his mouth, Bellepop 48 explained that the session had been called to discuss the charcoal situation.
What again? A heckler yelled. Let's have less teeth-chipping and more action.
One of the Master-at-Arms contingent had the heckler by the tail in a flash, but he had to let him go, since the dragon had no number. Old Bellepop's face was a sight to see.
There was a day, not many 1,000 years ago, when such outrageous behavior was unheard of, he bellowed angrily.
There was a day when we had charcoal to burn too, someone shouted. From the first, the trend was apparent to Dithyram. Kuber's agents had been planted well, and they did their work well, inciting the crowd to shout insults and demand action instead of deliberation. The uproar was at a high point when Bendar introduced a proposal to migrate outside. That brought a quick hush over the crowd. Bellepop's flame testers stood straight up for an instant, and his eyes bulged. Kuber looked at Dithyram.
Great dragon stars, he said. That was one of my employees who did that. And then he added, Was I correct? Bendar is no longer with me as of the time he made that idiotic motion.
Dithyram watched Kuber and said nothing. Someone seconded the motion. The Stooges began to clamor, and the matter had to go to discussion, which generated more heat than sanity. And then Bendar yelled,
Ask Kuber about the outside. He's been out there.
Kuber looked distressed and reluctant to speak.
It's true, I've been outside, Kuber said, but not very far. I wouldn't want to influence a decision on the meager basis of what. Tell us what you saw, a stooge demanded. Well, there were metasequoia trees higher than 4 long dragons, side by side, over acre after acre, and... They were that way here when we first came, Dithyram shouted. If I'd had any cooperation... Silence! Bellepop roared, looking curiously at Dithyram. You, a 14 dragon, acting like any of these D-numbered ruffians. He nodded at Kuber. Proceed. As I said, I didn't get very far, so I can't say how safe it may be outside, Kuber said. But you saw tall trees, someone yelled. Just think, trees as tall as 4 long dragons, trees to make charcoal by the basket for everyone, another stooge roared. The crowd began to go wild at the thought of so much food just waiting to be reduced to edible condition. Even the number 3 counselor was carried away. He forgot he was sitting on a stone seat instead of traditional dragonwood, and took a big bite out of the chair, chewing vigorously. Even in the excitement, some ancient thought about stone stirred in Dithyram's mind as he watched the counselor, but the impression didn't quite gel. Someone demanded a vote on Bendar's motion. Dithyram got the floor and began to plead for a postponement of the vote, offering to lead a detail outside to scout. The crowd listened, but they were too excited to hear. He kept trying. He wanted time for that unformed hunch in his mind to come into the open, that thought about stone. Dithyram was a strong believer in hunches, like his seafaring grandfather, who had got a hot flash about learning to strike with his feet just 2 days before going against St. George. The hunch had worked too, as dragon history proved, although men were said to have a different version. Observing the reaction of his words on sober, reliable dragons, Dithyram began to hope he might get a postponement. He was vaguely disturbed when he saw that Francipip was watching him without expression. Kuber was listening intently, nodding as if in complete agreement. Even the shady, well-fueled characters quit heckling as Dithyram began to gain power with each new thought.
He outlined the terrible dangers that lay outside, quoting from the last quarterly report, every 25 years, of the Dragonfly Intelligence Bureau and Courier Service, which had stressed the fact that men had developed much better swords than the ones St. George and St. Michael had found so ineffective. "We'll have to stay right here and develop new foods," he said. "With the cooperation of every able-bodied dragon, we can avert starvation. To move would be sure death." Old Bellapop was looking at Dithyram with pride. They didn't cheer when the speech was over. They were too busy thinking. Hunger was a driving thing that robbed reason, but some details of the DIB's report had been pretty gruesome and shocking. Bellapop 48 asked if there was anyone who cared for further discussion. For several moments, no one raised his tail to get the floor. Dithyram began to hope that he might do better than secure a postponement. He might get a vote to defeat the move proposal. "Brother Grand Master," Gorgabub was speaking, "this is undeniably a weighty matter, not to be decided hastily. On the other hand, hunger is a weighty matter too, and some decision must be forthcoming." He went on and on with masterly double talk, from which little jets of wit sparkled brightly. The crowd began to chuckle deep in their fireboxes, and soon they were forgetting the awesome things Dithyram had mentioned. "Reluctant as I know Kuber 13 is to endanger this nation by giving further evidence that may cause us to embark on a course fraught with dangers and uncertainty, in my humble opinion, as an unnumbered dragon," Gorgabub gave them time to consider why he had no number. The fourth counselor, the cuckold in the case, turned crimson and studied his front claws. The crowd laughed, and Gorgabub raised his flame testers in innocent surprise. "In my humble opinion, I think Kuber should give us a demonstration of the new food he discovered while exploring outside." "New food? What's this?" the crowd began to buzz. New food talk had been old hat for 500,000 years. Dithyram had just mentioned it in an academic sort of way, but nothing had ever come of new food talk. "Well, I hesitate." Cougar had to be ordered by Bellapop. But watching closely, Dithyram saw how pleased Kuber was, and how sure of himself he was. Kuber took his stance at the lower end of a wide lane cleared of dragons. A lumpy-tailed, fat-jowled dragon with a fatuous smirk suddenly appeared beside Kuber, carrying a stoppered length of Beowulf stock. Kuber removed the plug and drank from the hollow stem. Dithyram frowned. What sort of trickery was this? That Beowulf stock could only hold a small amount of anything, and liquid was no good for food, except to wet down the fires and make a little steam. "Keep your eye on yonder Tristram plant, the one in full bloom," Kuber said. He gave a few preliminary bellows motions of his diaphragm and cut loose. The terrific gush of orange flame that he emitted was the likes of which no dragon had ever seen. A great many spectators, crowding their heads into the lane to get a better view, fell back on their tails, clutching their big noses. The fourth counselor went chin over tail off his stone seat. Bellapop's gray flame testers stood straight up, the ends spinning in tight circles. He showed the reds of his underlids in pure amazement at the sight. The full blooming Tristram plant, at least the length of 10 long dragons removed from Kuber, was stripped of foliage. Nothing remained but smoldering fragments of the larger stems. Choking from the dense black smoke that had edged the blast, Dithyram clawed at his eyes and looked at Kuber's flame testers. They were glowing purple, a color no food ever had produced in any testers before. "By the wattles of that old dragon of a mother-in-law of mine," someone near Dithyram swore. "By the beard of Typhon," someone said. Typhon had created earthquakes all over the world, but nothing like this. Kuber smiled and wiped his chin. "I did this only because the Grand Master so ordered it," he said. Bellapop reached up to steady his spinning flame testers. "You found this food outside Kuber 13? "Yes, but I didn't have time to make a complete survey. There may be more, and of course, there may be a great deal more of it." Sniffling hungrily at the delicious black smoke, the crowd went wild. "Vote! Vote!" hundreds shouted. Dithyram knew defeat when it scorched the end of his nose, but he tried to get the floor to propose that voting be deferred until he could lead a patrol outside to make a complete investigation of the extent of Kuber's find. He didn't get the floor. 3-1, they voted to migrate. Little dragons were already eating the blackened remains of the Tristram plant. An admiring crowd was clamoring around Kuber, and Francipip was right at his side. Dithyram looked toward old Bellepop, who had just got his flame testers under control. They shook their heads sadly at each other.
"Some blast, eh, Dithy?" Gorgabub had come up beside Dithyram.
"You traitorous son of a man! You—"
"Take it easy," Gorgabub said. "Don't burn the lining out of your nose. You don't think the move proposal would have gone to vote before someone asked Kuber to give that clinching demonstration, do you? It was bound to come, but now I'm still solid with Kuber, I think."
"I'm wondering just how solid," Dithyram said suspiciously. "How did you know he had that new food?" He glared toward Kuber, who was holding Francipup's right foot and smiling graciously at the bedazzled lunkheads. "What is that strange liquid, anyway?" Gorgabub shrugged. "Beats me. Something he got outside, no doubt. I found that much out from Bendar." Gorgabub frowned slightly. "I got Bendar fooled, but I'm not so sure about Kuber. He's a smooth one." Dithyram took his eyes off Francipip and tried to forget her. "New food or not, we can't go outside and face men and their new swords that don't break so easily as they used to." "You know how long you've got to do something," Gorgabub said, referring to the ancient custom of allowing a 3-day cooling period for every decision that affected the entire nation. Only once in all dragon history had a decision been changed by the necessary unanimous vote, rendered 3 times by secret ballot. Dithyram stared thoughtfully at the stone seat the counselor had nipped. Bellepop was on the dais alone, all the other high counselors having rushed over to Kuber without even waiting for the formality of adjournment. The old Grand Master was staring sadly at his tail. "Of course, there's still the challenge," Gorgabub said. Dithyram's spine projections went rigid. The challenge. He hated the very sound of the word. By law so ancient, the history of it had been lost. Any numbered dragon could challenge another in the presence of the Grand Council to fight to the death, to prove which one was right. Dithyram was not afraid of Kuber or any other dragon. What galled him was that the entire nation would be obliged by law to follow a decision established on the basis of brute force. No dragon, not even old Bellepop, knew when the challenge had last been used to replace reason. If there were any other way out, Dithyram did not intend to fall back to methods 100 million years old. He took another look at the nipped chair. There might be another way to beat Kuber.
"Of course, if you want me to take charge of the migration,"
Kuber was saying modestly as Dithyram passed on his way to have a talk with Bellepop 48. Francipip was still beside the big gush. She barely glanced at Dithyram when he went by. Well, if she were that kind of dragonette. 2 afternoons later, his tail aching, his feet worn down until they hurt at every step, Dithyram was scrambling over rocks at the upper end of a little valley, where even small metasequoias would not grow. His teeth were sore, and his jaws felt as if they couldn't crush another rock. For 2 days he'd tried them all, soft ones, hard ones, every color of stone in Dragonvia. He had a heavy feeling in his firebox and a harsh taste in his mouth. He longed for even a few bites of charcoal to take the grit from his teeth and warm his stomach. He stopped to rest a few minutes on an outcrop of blue shale, thinking bitterly that he was a fool. No other dragon was giving a hoot besides Bellepop. They were all talking about moving, getting ready, and some elements were starting a campaign to make Kuber a strong dragon and dispense with the Grand Council entirely. For a moment or two, Dithyram was tempted to say to heck with the whole impossible quest he was on. Tomorrow, after the vote was affirmed, a mere formality, he would take his place as master of the advance detail and go forth to be killed. He didn't mind getting knocked off by men for the good of the nation, but he was quite sour about being chopped up for the good of Kuber 13. But unless he found what he was after, or used the challenge, death was sure, not only for him, but for most of the nation. And he still couldn't bring himself to use the challenge. 14,000 years of honorable family history stood between him and wanton brute force. He got up with a groan, the expelled air barely warmer than the temperature around him. Tail dragging wearily, he went on, sampling rocks here and there. Each bite hurt his teeth and made his stomach more sour, but he kept trying. Kuber had found a new food, and surely it couldn't have been that liquid that he pulled the mumbo-jumbo with. If there had been a new food close outside, why not also in Dragonvia? Bellapop 48 had said that Bellapop 45 once had talked of a sustaining food that served as emergency rations when a small party of raiding dragons from the old flying days had been grounded by bad weather on an island somewhere off the coast of Gaul. Bellapop said that his ancestor had brought home a few pieces of the rock as a curiosity. He thought it had been black, but he wasn't sure. Dithyram tried another piece of shale. It was just like all the rest. A little later, he tried another piece of obsidian. It was shiny black and looked just like all the other pieces of obsidian he had eaten. This one was no different. He ran his tongue along his aching teeth and rubbed one foot on his abused stomach. At midnight, sore and weary, his quest still a failure, pulling his tail behind him like a dead thing, he followed the dragon star back to his cavern shaded by Beowulf plants. On the way, he passed through a little grove of trees his crews had planted 100 years before. Some vandal had eaten 3 of them. Well, it didn't matter now. Tree-eater, was he? He remembered Bendar's jeering smile. Dithyram had never been a tree-eater. Even now, when faint with hunger and nearly exhausted, he wouldn't touch a tree. He dragged on. Well, maybe he had licked the pitch off a few trees, but that hadn't been much of a crime, and the time he and Gorgabub had got the firebox ache from munching young trees was so long ago. Tired as he was, his flame testers warned him with a gentle vibration when someone approached his cavern. Someone was inside, waiting in the dark for him. Any dragon's home was free to another, but one who entered another's cavern during the owner's absence was obliged to send a message to the owner immediately by dragonfly courier. No one had sent Dithyram a message, and he had seen any number of oriental dragonflies winging about on their night shift duties. Dithyram straightened his tired shoulders. He tipped first right and then left as he flexed the muscle of his front legs. And then he went straight for the door to confront the intruder. So intent was he that he did not hear the faint rustle in the Beowulf plants on his right. The next instant, his head was full of dragon stars. He heard a dragonette scream. He felt his legs go sidewise. His chin hit the ground with a thump, and then no more. He came to on his own bed of shredded Beowulf leaves, with a taste in his mouth like all the rocks he'd eaten for 2 days. "Are you all right, Dithy? Are you all right?" The words came from a long distance away, threading their way through spinning stars and exploding spheres that gradually settled into the dim outlines of the cavern ceiling. He tried to sit up, and a cool claw pressed against his nose, forcing him back. "Drink this." Someone poured dew from a Beowulf cup into his mouth. Dithyram blinked his eyes. "Frazee." He tried again to sit up and fell back with a moan that knocked small chips from the ceiling. "Easy, Dithy dear. Your head isn't as thick as even I thought it was."
"Don't call me that silly name."
Dithyram rested for several minutes, and then a new thought struck him. He sat up.
"This is highly irregular," he cried.
Frazee laughed a tinkling little sound that ran along the rock walls like music from a Sigmund vine flute. "Don't be stuffy," she said. "If my being here is irregular, so are the times." She took another curled leaf of dew from a stone table. Dithyram drank and considered somewhat hazily. Being caught in such improper circumstances with Francepup would lose him and Bellapop their numbers. But all he could think of was what would happen to Francepip. He could see all the gimlet-eyed, old, unmarried Dragonoras whispering behind their front claws. Well, she was here.
"What hit me?"
he asked. "A rock. He was raising it in both front feet to let you have another when I yelled and threw your flame tester brush at him and scared him off. From the looks of your flame testers, I'd say breaking the brush on his head was no great loss."
"I haven't had time for primping," Dithyram said grumpily. "Who was raising a rock?" he added suddenly.
"Bendar. Everybody in Dragonvia knows what you've been trying to do the last 2 days, including Kuber." Dithyram touched his aching head and stared at a large leaf basket on the floor.
"What were you doing here?"
"Waiting to talk to you when I heard you coming, and looked out just in time to see Bendar crown you."
"Why didn't you send a dragonfly?"
"The courier division of the DIB has been corrupted by Kuber for over 100 years. Bellapop has been able to keep the intelligence division out of Kuber's control only by a tough fight. I supposed you knew all that," she said. There was a lot of things he hadn't paid much attention to, Dithyram thought. His next brain wrinkle was the one that finally cleared his head.
"Did Bendar see you?"
Francepip nodded.
I'm afraid so. That sort of complicates things, doesn't it?
I'll tear Womp him into a pulp. I'll annihilate him.
Franzipop watched him calmly. My pop always says, when making charcoal, don't bother with the small limbs.
But there's no evidence against Coober.
Not Grand Council evidence, no. But why do you think I've been shining up to the loathsome brute? In spite of his throbbing head and the rock-heavy feeling in his stomach, Dithyram felt his heart give a great leap. He felt strong enough to rush out immediately and resume his search for the black food. Not only that, he had a hot flash about finding it. He stood up, and then he fell flat on his chin with a crash that knocked more chips of rock off the ceiling. Poor dear, you're famished. Franzipip began to open the leaf basket. It was filled to the brim with choice charcoal, the smell of which was enough to get Dithyram's chin off the floor a little.
Not black goods, he muttered.
Of course not. It's rations from a good many honest dragons who know what you've been trying to do. Gorgabub contributed a triple ration.
That last would be black good stuff for sure, Dithyram thought. I couldn't touch a bite of it.
When the basket was half gone, and his rising fires were making him feel like a new dragon, Dithyram asked through a mouthful of food,
What kind of rock did Bendar hit me with?
Not a black one like you're trying to find. I've tested it myself. Franzipip's lavender eyes were soft and luminous in the dusk. Dithy, dear, do you think there's a possible chance of finding a new food before we have to move?
Dithyram took another mouthful of charcoal. If I only knew exactly what it was that Coober had.
It was good-smelling water in a funny container made of something tougher than a rock, although it bent easily. In a weak moment, Coober told me that it fell from a huge, huge dragonfly like none he'd ever seen. The big dragonfly seemed to be having trouble, Coober said. Its wings wouldn't move, and then it dropped the funny container full of good-smelling water. Dithyram munched thoughtfully. Water had made that amazing, fiery gush from Coober. It seemed incredible, and yet it must be so. If he had some of the GS water, he could have Gorgabub check it, since Gorgabub knew water if anyone did. Maybe there was more of it in Dragonvia, dropped by big dragonflies. Coober left it open for the citizens to think that the woods outside are full of water food like that, Franzipip said. But they aren't. I checked that myself.
You went outside?
Dithyram almost strangled on the last mouthful of charcoal. I had to know, Franzipip said. You were busy, and Gorgabub was the only other one I could trust, but he was afraid to go outside. She leaned close to Dithyram, her soft eyes full of fear. Dithyram, there's men not 200 dragon lengths from where the GS water was. If we have to move, you'll be the first to run into them. I know you're strong and brave, but I just couldn't stand it without you, Dithy. Dithyram did the only thing he could. His fires glowing from the basketful of food, he put his face close to hers and warmed her with a sigh that curled wonderful blue flame over both their heads. Oh, Dithy, she murmured. Shamelessly, he shuddered a little to make his scales gleam brightly. In a few moments, she'd pushed him away with one dainty foot. Coober thinks I'm going to scram back here with him as soon as the men fighting starts. He's got it all worked out so that he and his gang will form the rear guard. They're not only going to run out, but they're not going to let more than 1/4 of the population back into Dragonvia. Dithyram paced around the room, rapping the walls with savage thumps of his tail. Dithy, you've simply got to find that black food. It's the only thing that will reverse the vote when it comes up for a final approval tomorrow.
Then by the tail of Typhon, the Quakemaker, I'll find it.
And then a long heritage of behavior that scorned boasting asserted itself.
If it's here, if I can, I'll do my best.
No honorable dragon could have promised more. Dawn was breaking when Dithyram came wearily up the dragway toward the water filtration plant. He looked half the night for the container of GS water. He covered every claw length of the territory outside that Franzipip had described, but the GS water was gone. Discouragement rode heavily on his spine extensions, making them wag limply. He had about half a day to find the wonderful black rock that old Bellapop's Gramps had mentioned. If it were black, if the story hadn't been just another dragon tale. He stopped to drink below the low filtration pond. The water was very good, although it didn't carry the tiny bits of charcoal from the filter beds like it used to. Probably Gorgabub had been cutting down on the charcoal all the time, selling it on the BG market, or eating most of it himself. Well, that didn't matter much now. Gorgabub was Gorgabub, honest as long as it served his ends, a strong friend when he had nothing to lose. He'd always been that way, a likable dragon in spite of his faults. Dithyram would never forget the time when they were quite young and out on a prowling expedition near a colony of blue-winged dragons, the females of which... Dithyram smiled a little at the memory. He was surprised to find Gorgabub at this early hour, pacing on the dam at the upper pond. His flame testers were uncombed, and he had an untidy look about him, but it was the depth of brooding sadness in Gorgabub's scarlet eyes that struck Dithyram hardest. "Good dragon morn," Gorgabub said breezily. "Any luck?" Dithyram shook his head. Gorgabub flipped a pebble toward the gleaming surface of the pond. "I'm going with you in the advanced detail this afternoon," he said gloomily. "What?" "Oh, I know it sounds heroic. Shady but charming Powell repents and goes out to die with his dragonhood chum in final glorious combat. I'd like to believe that myself, only it isn't so." "Then why?" "Simple, Dithy. Kuber suspects I tipped you off. Last night he sent one of his plug uglies here to give me the works, but I was a little too fast. I busted the character's tail and sent him back to his boss." Dithyram considered. After all, if Gorgabub were as selfish as he tried to make out, and as most dragons believed him to be, he never would have warned Dithyram in the first place, for he knew how foully the cards had been stacked. Dithyram realized he had been neglecting one of the important obligations of a numbered one, to search deeply at all times for the best in any dragon. The thought went a great deal further than that. Sure as he was of Kuber's evil plans, he had no moral right to believe him guilty, and yet he knew that Kuber was guilty. Bub. Using a nickname was considered beneath the dignity of a numbered adult male, but Dithyram didn't care now. "I wasn't quite so fast myself when Bendar gave me a lump." He told Gorgabub all about it. "How do you like that?" Gorgabub shook his head. "You can't get at Kuber by having Francipip testify that Bendar attacked you, because the fact that she was at your house alone is enough to denumber Bellapop and you, and that would leave Kuber right smack in the GM's seat." He stared at his tail. "Well, the way it stacks, he's going to get there anyway. I can't think of a thing to stop him besides the challenge. I even went outside last night and got that new food of his in the hope." "You got the GS water?" "Well, I sent a foredragon from the plant, a G named Grafto." "Let's have a look at this new food," Dithyram cried. "Maybe we can find more like it right here in Dragonvia." Gorgabub shook his head. "Not a chance, brother. I know water, and I can say for sure there's nothing in the country like this GS stuff." In Gorgabub's quarters, Dithyram examined the container curiously. It was made of a hard, though yielding material that defied description. The smell of the contents made him drool. "Easy," Gorgabub warned. "A very little swallow is about all you can handle. I took 2 big drinks and like to blew my teeth out when I belched. Just a normal belch, mind you, not a genuine firebox blast." Dithyram took a tiny swallow. Immediately, he felt his fires surging hotter than they ever had before from such a small amount of food. Walking over to the dam, he trained toward a distant flock of Archaeopteryx birds on the water. He let go. The recoil knocked him back against Gorgabub. Orange flame and black smoke shot across the pond. His flame testers turned deep purple. The Archaeopteryx birds rose squawking, their tail feathers scorched to a crisp. "By Typhon," Dithyram said, looking sideways at his quivering flame testers. "It's powerful," Gorgabub said, "but outside of a few small shots that I suspect Kuber has, there isn't any more besides what we have here." Dithyram tried another blast. It just wouldn't come. "Doesn't stick to your firebox very well, does it? Not like charcoal." Gorgabub shook his head. "No, it will take something more sustaining than GS water to save the country." Gorgabub was thinking in broader terms than himself now, Dithyram thought. "Maybe if we took the GS water before the council and demonstrated that it's no more than flash-in-the-firebox stuff. Very delicious, but just fluff," Gorgabub said. "That one gush Kuber showed has got everybody dazzled. Then there's the trees he described outside. No, Gorgabub, I've got to find a new food, and fast." "There's just one other way. The challenge. You give it to Kuber, and if the scrap starts to go against you, I'll be standing by with a load of GS water and burn his tail off," Gorgabub suggested. Dithyram shook his head slowly. "The trouble with me," Gorgabub said, "is that I can't think in honorable terms." Dithyram started off to resume his hopeless search. "You'd better dump that GS water before it gets you into trouble." "Before you go," Gorgabub seemed oddly hesitant. Well, I may not have another chance to talk to you alone before the move, and I just want you to know that I had nothing to do with swiping that 10 tons of charcoal from the government stockpile. Kuber and Bendar did that. Dithyram came back. How do you know? Grafto, my foredragon, saw them.
Why didn't you say so before? That's enough evidence right there to take care of Kuber. Grafto can testify before the Grand Council this afternoon.
Gorgabub looked down at his tail. He can't.
Why not? An eyewitness to the crime.
You may as well know, Gorgabub said. I haven't used any charcoal in the filter beds for almost 200 years. Grafto and I have been eating all the charcoal consigned to the plant, and Kuber knows it. He shrugged. You can see what kind of a mess it would be, all us crooks trying to testify against each other before the Grand Council.
Yeah, I can see. A little knockdown on charcoal was to be expected, but to endanger the health of the whole nation.
That's where you're wrong, Gorgabub said. The inspectors have been passing the water as pure all the time, so the black rocks we've been substituting in the filter beds must have been—
Black rock,
Dithyram cried. Soft black rock? Sure, breaks up easily. Sometimes you can see where fern leaves have been in it. Grafto and I—
Did you ever eat any of this black rock?
Are you nuts? Hey, quit shaking me. When Dithyram let go, Gorgabub said, With plenty of high-class charcoal around, we should be eating black rock. Dithyram grabbed Gorgabub by the front legs and hurled him into the pond. Then he jumped in after him. Later, when there were 2 large baskets of soft black rock on the dam, and both dragons were covered with mud and sand, Gorgabub grinned and said, You might at least have said what you were after. I could have opened the valves and drained the pond.
Watch!
Dithyram's firebox was beautifully aglow, maybe not with the sudden, intense heat of GS water, but with a solid and wonderful feeling. He pumped his diaphragm and sent a burst of red flame and dense black smoke across the pond. He did it again and again. His flame testers turned bright blue and twanged loudly.
That black rock sticks with you, he bellowed happily.
A trifle smoky, Gorgabub said.
Complete mastication will result in better carburation.
Dithyram pounded Gorgabub on the shoulder.
Dragon alive, you did it! You found the new food!
Speak for yourself, Dithy, Gorgabub said modestly.
Now you're sure about the extent of it?
Gorgabub was sure. A whole swamp of it, and a mountain behind. We'll have to dig a little, but my conservative estimate is that there's enough to supply the country for 300,000 or 400,000 years.
By that time, I'll have my reforestation program so well in hand that you won't be able to move for trees. I'll have metasequoias higher than a dragonfly can go.
They grinned and beat each other on the back until they both fell into the pond. Dithyram scrambled out first.
Come on, we've got a big job ahead.
It was then he saw Bendar peering at him from the edge of a Beowulf patch on the hillside. Even while he was setting himself for a charge, Dithyram heard Gorgabub yell,
Run, Bendar! Run for your tail! He sees you!
Gorgabub reached up and got Dithyram by the left rear leg and dragged him into the pond. They struggled fiercely, sending great geysers of sand and water into the air, breathing fire into each other's teeth. When Dithyram broke free, Bendar was gone. Heaving with rage, Dithyram poised his tail for a whomp to knock Gorgabub clear into the outside. Hold it, Gorgabub said. You manhead, you. I thought all the time you were hep to the act. He rubbed his neck. Who ever heard of a quadruple Nelson before? Hold it, Gorgabub said. You manhead, you. I thought all the time you were hep to the act. He rubbed his head. Who ever heard of a quadruple Nelson before? That is, before I realized you weren't kidding and my back was nearly broken. He rose, hunching his shoulders and making a wry face. Didn't you see him talking to the dragonflies just before you got ready to blow your top? Dithyram didn't whomp, but he held his tail ready. Those dragonflies will be telling Kuber all about what we found in less time than it would have taken for you to catch Bendar. Gorgabub brushed sand off his stomach. On top of that, Bendar is no Tristram flower. Even if you had caught him, you would have had a terrible time of it. And you, my glowering friend, need your energy for Kuber. Gorgabub still didn't relax. Maybe I have preserved my inn with Kuber, or at least Bendar, and that may prove very useful, Gorgabub said. You know, of course, you forced me to help look for black rock. Dithyram's tail was still poised. You're overlooking the character you sent back to Kuber with a busted tail. Gorgabub sighed. So I am. I told you that before I began to come clean. The truth is, I didn't bust his tail. I broke his head and had Grafto dispose of the body. And now, even if Kuber doesn't trust me, I may still gain some advantage from Bendar, who may. Such devious thinking left Dithyram confused. He relaxed slowly. You could save yourself lots of trouble if you tell me the truth the first time. Gorgabub sighed. I know. I used to try it, but I just never had any fun that way.
Let's get busy, Dithyram said. The worst is ahead.
They loaded all the black food they could into first move surplus knapsacks and roused out Grafto to do the same. Grafto was not in very good condition, having tried 3 large swallows of GS water the night before. The resultant blast had given him a bad shaking up and some scale separation, and it was evident that he wouldn't be able to keep up with them on the march to the Grand Council place. Gorgabub insisted on taking along a Beowulf leaf and canteen of GS water. Grafto fell behind from the first. He was far behind when Gorgabub and Dithyram got warning of an ambush. Dithyram's flame testers, although covered with a black deposit from the new food, seemed extra sensitive. They twanged a warning when he and Gorgabub were still some distance from a very narrow place where the tailway ran between cliffs. As much as he disliked the loss of time necessary to scale the cliff on one side and come in behind the spot where his flame testers warned him 3 dragons were waiting above the tailway, Dithyram knew they had to do it. They couldn't take a chance on the narrow place. Too much depended on their getting before the Grand Council in time to avert the move. It took them a great deal longer than they had expected to climb the cliff on the left. Halfway up, a sharp rock tore a hole in Dithyram's knapsack, and his precious burden of black food went spilling down the cliff. More misfortune struck a few minutes later. Gorgabub slipped and almost tumbled from the heights. In bracing against him to keep him from falling, Dithyram ripped a gash in the second knapsack. They lost almost half of it. They reached the top of the cliff with their fires low and held a brief consultation. In order to properly blast the 3 lying in ambush and still have enough fuel to make up for the lost time, they would have to eat what was left of Gorgabub's cargo. They ate it, telling each other that Grafto would arrive at the meeting with his food in time to show it around, and they both knew that Grafto, as slow as he had been when he left them, would be lucky if he got to the meeting place at all. They came in above and behind 3 of the worst-looking plug uglies in all of Dragonvia. Dithyram scorched the tails of 2, and Gorgabub got the other, using just 1 tiny swallow of GS water. It's a crime, he said, that this stuff has no more body to it than it does. We wouldn't have had to use all our black food. Gorgabub wanted to finish off the 3. Groaning and in great pain as they wrapped their tails in healing Beowulf leaves, the trio admitted readily that Kuber had sent them.
And a lot of good it's gonna do to you to know that, one of them snarled. There's nothing you can do to stop the move plans now.
We should have scorched their tails off, Gorgabub said. He tapped the canteen and said to Dithyram, Let me work that pock-marked, push-faced one over with a little of this.
We haven't time.
They swung down toward the tailway, Dithyram fretting at the fearful loss of time, even more than at the loss of black food. All the dragons in the land were gathered at the meeting place when Gorgabub and Dithyram arrived. Some of the older families were weeping quietly into Beowulf leaf handkerchiefs. Numbered ones and other responsible citizens stood in small groups, talking a little. But like the rest, they had their knapsacks on, their flame tester combs tied to their left ears in the traditional manner for moves. Only once in history had a decision been reversed. There was no reason to believe this one would be changed. I'll see you later, Gorgabub said. I'm going to circulate. Kuber came forward toward Dithyram, who thought sourly that Kuber must have done a full hour of shuddering to put his scales in such gleaming condition.
Didn't I say he'd be here?
Kuber asked the crowd loudly.
Good old Dithyram, master of the advance detail. I'll give my right front leg to be with you today, but I must guard the rear.
In a low voice he said,
Some of them thought you were going to take a rum out, old friend.
I'll be here from start to finish, Dithyram said.
Ah, yes,
Kuber smiled. He stood on his tail and waved his front legs at the crowd.
Well, I guess there's nothing to hold us up. The sooner... We haven't gone through the ceremony of final consideration,
Billapop 48 roared.
Formality, Kuber
muttered under his breath.
"My apologies, Grand Master," he shouted.
While the Master-at-Arms was beating his tail for order, someone rubbed against Dithyram. It was the little flibberty-gibbet Fifimum. Dithyram moved aside as far as he could, one eye on Francipip, who was watching from near the dais. "Gorgabub sent me to tell you that you-know-who has bribed the clerk of the muster to show 5 dragons as scouting the border where we're to cross. Grafto is one of them," Fifimum whispered. Kuber was playing it very tight, Dithyram thought. 4 of the names entered falsely on the rolls would belong to the dragon Gorgabub had killed, and to the 3 with burnt tails. It would be almost impossible to delay the move by proving that 5 men were improperly accounted for. Dithyram saw Kuber watching with an amused smile. Then he looked above bobbing flame-tester combs and saw Gorgabub talking and laughing beside Bendar. The Master-at-Arms finally gained order. Winklecup 10 gave the customary prayer for the soul of Winklecup 9. The clerk began to read in a rapid mumble the matter that needed final consideration. Then Bellapop rose and intoned the familiar words.
3 days have fled, and each and every dragon here assembled has had time to weigh, to consider, and to reflect upon the decision here rendered by the democratic process of free dragons and free voting.
"Final vote? Let's get to voting?" Gorgabub made the demand. The others nodded. Bellapop looked sad and majestic as he raised both front feet.
"If there be among us one with conclusive evidence that we have made a wrong decision, let him speak now or forevermore."
Dithyram didn't hear the rest. He was standing in a cold sweat, and Kuber was grinning at him evilly. 3 large, powerful dragons had Dithyram by the tail, not biting, just holding firmly and ready to ruin him. Their treacherous act was concealed by others of Kuber's gang, standing solidly around them. Kuber had edged back toward Dithyram's left shoulder, out of line of a direct blast.
"One little peep," he said softly, "and you get the works." "You are guilty, you scummy son of a man!"
Dithyram tried to move, and the 3 large dragons clamped down hard enough to make him wince.
"Honorable sucker,"
Kuber jeered.
"keep your big yap shut, and I'll give you the honor of dying at the head of the advanced detail."
He laughed softly.
"I'll even see that a grove of trees is dedicated to your memory as a hero after Francipip and I return. Make one little protest."
He smiled and clicked his big teeth twice.
"Then, since no dragon has raised his voice..."
Bellapop looked in appeal toward the part of the crowd where he had been able to see Dithyram a few moments before.
"To introduce factual evidence, I hereby declare that the decision of 3 days now pass is sustain..."
Bellows of pain broke out behind Dithyram. He felt his tail released. Dust rose from an earth-shaking scramble, and the roaring of outraged dragons was terrible. Dithyram did something most unorthodox. He swung a left hook smack under Kuber's ear, and then a right hook to the nose as Kuber was sagging. Kuber went flat on his belly, shaking his head weakly. Then Dithyram had time to look around. Francipip was standing behind him. He saw her emit a little dragonet-like jet of orange flame that seared the tail of one of the outlaws who had been holding Dithyram. The character already had a scorched tail tip, but in his eagerness to escape, he had let all 4 feet fly sideways and was momentarily helpless on his belly. But he sure could bellow. The gangsters who had been screening were trying to get away fast. One was tangled up in the crowd, and an old Dragonora was belaboring him with a Beowulf leaf umbrella, having mistaken his frenzied bumping against her for something other than a desire to escape. Francipip emitted another tiny jet at a tail sticking out of a tangle of legs and other tails. A dragonet yelled shrilly, and Fifimum disengaged herself from the mass. "Oops," Francipip said. "I mistook you for a dragon." "Like fun you did." Fifimum rubbed her tail.
"Order! Order! Master-at-Arms!"
Bellapop was bellowing like 60.
"What's going on over there?"
"I protest the decision," Dithyram yelled. "I have evidence."
Kuber staggered up, recovering fast.
"I have evidence that he attacked me foully and without provocation."
"Shut up, you!" Francipip tried another little blast, but her fuel was gone. "Gorgabub should have given me more GS water," she said to Dithyram. He saw what was happening and knew he couldn't get past that bunch of plug uglies.
"Address the chair!"
Bellapop shouted. It took some time to restore order, and then Dithyram began to tell what he had found. At the moment, he had no time to accuse Kuber, because the important thing was to convince the assembly that there actually was a new food right in Dragonvia. Kuber got the floor while Dithyram was taking a deep breath.
Where is this new food? Let him demonstrate this black stuff he talks about.
Watch it, Dithy, Francipup said. He wants you to use up all your fires, and then he'll throw the challenge. Dithyram had been thinking the same thing. He looked over in appeal to Gorgabub, still standing beside Bendar. But Gorgabub shook his head. Apparently, he was still trying to deceive Bendar. Gorgabub's complicated behavior had better start paying off soon, Dithyram thought grimly.
Make Dithyram 14 demonstrate this imaginary food, if he can,
Kuber shouted. The last thing Dithyram wanted to do was run his fires so low he wouldn't be at top strength for whatever was to come. The challenge was imminent, he was sure. He looked toward the tailway down which he had hoped weakly to see Grafto coming, with his burden of black food. No Grafto. He glanced at Gorgabub again. No dice. Dithyram demonstrated. He gave blast after blast of red flame and black smoke, and they shouted for him to continue until he could throw a flame no longer than a small dragon length.
By ancient law, I challenge Dithyram 14,
Kuber roared. A stunned silence smote the crowd. It was law, but no dragon could remember the last time anyone had fallen so low as to invoke it. Bellapop choked a little when he saw.
It is law. It is so. Prepare to observe the ancient law and abide by the outcome of the challenge.
That an issue of life or death for an entire nation depended on the outcome of brute force hurt Dithyram to the soul. But he was a numbered one and had to fight. At least he hadn't invoked the stupid law. Strangely, he didn't feel as hungry as he had expected to after demonstrating. He knew he couldn't throw much of a flame, but even so, his firebox had a comfortable feeling. The black food was really something. The nation fell back in an immense circle, and the contestants were made ready. Their flame testers were tied back, their claws examined, their tails were inspected, and seconds looked each other over to see if sharp rocks had been wedged between spine extensions. They were clean. Dithyram II, a 7 dragon appointed by Bellapop, came back from Kuber's corner with a worried look. I'm morally certain that Bendar slipped him a drink of that strange water food just before I got here, he said. The contestants came out of their corners, Kuber rolling from side to side in a confident swagger. Dithyram smelled GS water on his breath, while the referee was giving instructions. Kuber's big diamond was still on the end of his tail, but since he had worn it for more than 200 years, it was considered legal equipment, and the 7 Dragon Second had been unable to make him remove it.
Anything goes except tail burning, the referee said.
He wasn't quite out of the way when Kuber reached across him and knocked Dithyram flat with a short chop to the base of the brain. Sliding back to let his head clear, Dithyram reflected that Kuber might prove more than somewhat handy with his front feet. And here Dithyram had been thinking that he had discovered the left hook. For all his heavy tail, Kuber was fast. He pivoted so quickly that Dithyram barely had time to slide back another 15 feet to avoid having his teeth knocked out from a smoking tail womp just a foot or two above the ground. They grappled in the center of the ring, and Dithyram knew he was facing the most powerful dragon in the land when he failed to budge Kuber. He shifted tactics. 2 quick left hooks to the nose, and then Dithyram leaped on Kuber's back, while the latter's eyes were watering. He tried the quadruple Nelson he'd used on Gorgabub. Down, down, closer to the ground went Kuber's ugly face, his thick neck bowing. Kuber relaxed suddenly, arching his back, curling his tail under him for added power. Too late, Dithyram felt his feet slipping. He was thrown into the air. Kuber caught him 2 solid, jarring tail whomps in the long ribs while he was coming down. He lit heavily, and Kuber kicked him in the head with both hind feet. Quick as a dragonfly, Dithyram went under his heavier adversary, raking his rough spine extensions across Kuber's belly. It was an ancient trick, familiar to even very young dragons. Kuber bellowed mightily in pain, and snapped an instant too late at Dithyram's tail. They squared up and sparred in the center of the ring, taking a little breather. Then they mixed head-on in a teeth-jarring collision that made the earth tremble. For several moments they stood up and slugged it out, tail to tail, their clenched claws rattling like thunder on each other's body. If he hadn't known Kuber was a dirty fighter, Dithyram soon found out. Kuber jabbed his claws into Dithyram's eyes. He kneed with one hind foot in a clinch. He brought up the heel of his right front foot in an uppercut that made Dithyram's teeth click shut, and then he breathed fire in Dithyram's eyes. Ordinary flame wouldn't have bothered, but this GS water stung like the very devil. Blind for an instant, Dithyram backed off and hooked futilely with both front feet. Kuber laughed and swung the 3-pound diamond on his tail. It knocked sparks off Dithyram's head and knocked him flat out on his belly. The diamond shattered and flew through the air in 1,000 flashing arcs. Spectators snapped greedily at the pieces, for it was elementary that diamonds were somehow related to charcoal. Kuber paused an instant too long as he poised his tail for a killing blow. Groggy as he was, Dithyram went under Kuber and raked his spine extensions, the whole length of the lump-tailed dragon's body. In going out, he hooked one front leg around Kuber's left hind leg and spilled Kuber right on his nose. Then they started to fight. Side by side they stood, slugging it out with their tails. For a while, Kuber's heavier tail had the advantage in the thunderous exchange. But Dithyram, lean though his rations had been for several hundred years, had hardened his tail by patting the earth around newly planted trees. Little by little, he gained the upper tail. And then he was meeting Kuber's blows halfway, getting in one himself, and instead of bracing for the return, sending a smoking one right back to block Kuber's tail, mid-stroke. Restrained by law from cheering, spectators began to express their appreciation by vibrating their flame testers. The air was filled with twanging and the awful sounds of Dithyram whomping Kuber limp. But the pace was telling. Giving all the blows was wearing Dithyram down fast. Kuber knew that, and for some time he had been covering up and saving himself, for all the fearful beating he was absorbing. Suddenly he pivoted away, timing the move just as Dithyram swung a terrific whomp. Dithyram went off balance, fell on his side. Before he could recover, Kuber was on him, all 4 feet clamped tight. His breath was hot on Dithyram's tail, and the telltale sounds of diaphragm pumping came loudly. Kuber was going to use GS water to burn the very tail right off Dithyram. Dithyram did something no dragon had ever done before. He put everything he had into a rear foot left hook. It exploded against Kuber's nose and knocked him sliding on his belly 15 feet away. The twanging of flame testers was loudest ever heard in dragon history. Dithyram staggered up. For a moment, his tail was broadside to Kuber. The evil, enraged face was trained squarely on it, and Kuber was repumping his diaphragm. Dithyram risked all in feinting a charge. Then he threw himself sideways. The terrific gush of flame that spouted from Kuber missed Dithyram's tail just by the length of a baby dragon's flame testers. Kuber tried again, but GS water could produce only one enormous blast like that. He had shot his bolt. He knew it. Death was the penalty for breaking the no scorching code in the challenge. Kuber broke as Dithyram charged. With remarkable speed, the villain galloped for the hills that bordered the outside. Tired as he was, Dithyram could not overtake him. Then the Master-at-Arms and his assistants passed Dithyram, thundering fiercely after Kuber. Suddenly, they plowed to a stop and scattered. When he caught up, Dithyram saw that Kuber had gained the edge of a Sigmund-vined thicket and was facing toward his pursuers defiantly, sides heaving. Beside him was Bendar, and Bendar was loaded for dragons. His dark eyes were glinting with murderous lights. Little puffs of smoke and flame came from his nostrils, and his sides were glowing. He held aloft the canteen Gorgabub had carried from the filtration plant. "Stand back," he roared. "I'm loaded with the new food Kuber found outside. The first dragon to make a move will get his old tail blasted to a crisp." The Master-at-Arms and his assistants were brave dragons, but they had seen a demonstration of the GS water. They didn't look at each other as they began to move back, especially back from Dithyram, who was soon facing the murderous pair alone. "We're going outside," Bendar yelled. "We'll sign an appeasement pact with men, and when we've come back, we'll see who runs this country." Bendar and Kuber wouldn't come back, Dithyram knew. But men would after they had disposed of the pair, and men not believing even when they saw the inhabitants of Dragonvia. Kuber snatched the canteen from Bendar and took a big drink. He pumped his diaphragm and smiled evilly, his pale eyes looking directly at Dithrum's tail. Dithrum couldn't retreat. His code, his numbered heritage, would not let him. He charged. He hadn't gone more than 2 leaps when someone tackled him from behind. "Down!" came Gorgabub's voice. "Hug the ground!" Too long Kuber savored the revenge he was about to take. The tick of time passed. There came a terrible explosion. The ground bumped hard against Dithrum's chin. He saw parts of Kuber and Bendar floating high above the Sigmund vines, and heard Gorgabub laugh. "I conned Bendar into drinking almost a whole canteen of GS water. Dragon plumbing just wasn't built for a charge like that." On a hillside above a swamp, Dithrum stood 2 days later, holding Francipip's little right foot. Below, under the harsh dive of Grafto's voice, the itching from his scale separation had made him very mean. The survivors of Kuber's gang were doing the dirty work of removing the mucky overburden from a thick blanket vein of black food. Just one little item was bothering Dithrum. During the explanations before the Grand Council, Gorgabub had said that he and Grafto had saved 10 tons of charcoal from the filtration plant by substituting the black food, and that they had intended to turn it over to the proper authorities. Bellapop had swallowed that story and had made the rest of the council swallow it. Dithrum looked at the dragons Grafto was directing below. They wouldn't talk, even if they knew where that 10 tons of charcoal had really come from. They had been very lucky to get off with 10,000-year sentences to the black food mines. Still, Dithrum was troubled. As a numbered one, it was his duty to tell the truth. But he didn't want to do it. Francipip knew the truth, and she had told Dithrum to keep his mouth shut, or else she would make his life miserable after they were married next week. Still, he was a numbered one. "What would you say was the most remarkable thing of all that's happened in the last few days?" Bellapop asked Gorgabub. "Excepting, of course, that story you told about filtration charcoal." Dithrum swung around. Old Bellapop 48 was grinning from ear to ear. He winked at Dithrum, then cleared his throat and said, "Shall we take a closer look at operations below, Gorgabub 5? Gorgabub 5? Of course, the council could, in most extraordinary cases, restore 5,000 years to a denumbered dragon, but Dithrum hadn't heard a thing about the action. "By all means, let's stroll down, Billapop 48, Gorgabub said blandly. Francipip and Dithrum watched them go. Then Dithrum sighed. Francipip sighed. Jowl to jowl they sighed. Rich red fire curled around them, and a wonderfully scented cloud of black smoke rose above them. "Oh, Dithy 14, Francipip murmured. "Pippy," Dithrum said, a silly look on his face. The end.
This short story was originally published in the first issue of Fantasy Magazine, Volume 1, Number 1, February 1953. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this kind of content, you can help me grow this channel by liking this video, writing a comment with your thoughts, or subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications. I'm Number 1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.